We talked about the Bible being the book of books. It's 66 books, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, 1,500 years of writing. And I wanted to emphasize something that maybe I didn't emphasize enough last week, and that is that the Bible really is not a history book. It's not a math book. It's not what it is. It's the account of man's redemption, the redemption of man. As Franklin Camp would point out, redemption is on every page. Everything that God says from the beginning to the end is the idea of redemption for mankind. Now, we also took notice of, if you're looking at the history and you're wanting to read up on the history, there are a variety of ways to do it. Last week, I made sure we understood that there were the chapters on the history, and it would be good to really read one of those chapters every week before we even start our study. But that takes a lot of time. Then if you want to go to a deeper and get more details, of course, what you would do it would be to read the ones that are checked, and you would include numbers in that. When you read what you see on your slide, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and so forth, those are the history books. Those are the books that talk about history. I say again, the Bible's not a history book. Those are books about history. But the Bible, in all of that, is talking about the redemption of mankind. One thing we did not get to, and that is that the Bible has three dispensations, stewardships. And there's, depending on which chart you're looking at and which which outline you're looking at, you can talk about 12 periods, you can talk about 14 periods, you can talk about 15 periods. It depends on whether you're going to talk about the period, the silent years, and so forth and so on, how many of those you're going to combine as well. You'll notice at the top that we have, we'll notice at the bottom, you have the stones, that would be the two stones, that would be the 10 Commandments. That sets off a time frame. Before the giving of the 10 Commandments, you had the patriarchal age, and after that, you had the Mosaical age for Israel. Some seem to think that the law of Moses was also given to others and they were amenable to it. I suggest that's not the case. So you have eternity, then you have the beginning, and it goes until Mount Sinai, and then the law is given to Israel, and God would hone his thoughts in and his telling of what is occurring concerning redemption. He would talk about the idea of salvation for mankind. Now you then have the cross of Calvary, and of course, before the cross of Calvary would be the life of Christ, and after that would be the establishment of the church. When you get to the far right, you have eternity. Let me kind of say that just slightly different. Here you have the various ages: the patriarchal age, the Mosaical age, and the Christian age. 2,500 years for the patriarchal, 1,500 for the Mosaical, and Christianity began shortly after Christ was crucified and will last until eternity, which some people disagree with, but that's all right. They can be wrong if they want to. We would have in the mix of all of that the patriarchal age was for the family and the Mosaical age was for a nation, whereas going into all the world covers the Christian dispensation or age. You would have oral law under the patriarchal age. You would have the law of Moses under the Mosaical age, and you would have the law of Christ, the perfect law of liberty, under the Christian age. Some men that stand out whenever you're looking at these various ages would be Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, so forth. When it comes to the Mosaical age, of course, it would start at Mount Sinai, and it would be Moses and David the king, the prophets of God. They stand out. John the Baptist and Jesus. Jesus lived during the Mosaical age. He did not live during the Christian age from the standpoint of his earthly existence. We take notice of the third age, of the age we're in right now after the cross. And you have the 12, and the law that they would present would be the law of Christ. And the New Testament writers would be involved in that as well, which is about the church or the kingdom. And when you look in the Old Testament, you would have the coming of the king and the coming of the kingdom as well. Whereas since Pentecost, and all the writing would say he's coming again, the second coming, Hebrews chapter 9. Now, there are some figurative comings, as we found out during our study of the book of Revelation, but that pretty well tells you what we're talking about in our age summary. Let's take up where we need to in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The Old Testament survey from the beginning, that first period, the beginning period. In reality, you could stay right here for a year. I'm going to point out three basic things, three things I really want to get across, and the other two are important, yet these three are really important. First of all, in Genesis chapter 1, you have the greatness of God. In Genesis chapter 2, you have the goodness of God. In Genesis chapter 3, you have the grace of God. In chapter 4, you would have the comfort of God. And in chapter 5, you would have the chronology of God, as we would divide it as an outline for our thoughts. So first of all, God's greatness. And God's greatness, what you're talking about, of course, is the creation of mankind and the creation of all things. So that's what we're discussing today, especially. And so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You will take notice in verse 3, God said, let there be light. Verse 6, God said, let there be a firmament in the midst. In verse 9, God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and the dry land appear. Verse 11, God said, let the earth put forth grass. Verse 14, God said, let there be lights in the firmament, the greater and the lesser light, the sun and the moon. Thus, we studied that particular thought when we were in Revelation and creation. We take notice in verse 20, God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, let the birds fly. And then verse 24, God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things. Last of all, in verse 26, God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. A good study would be for us to look at what that means to be in the image of God, but it basically means that the animals didn't have a soul and we do. And our soul is full of the compassion of God, the goodness of God, the love of God, and who God is. Mankind is that way. We also take notice as we go down through here that in verse 5, there was evening and there was morning, day one, or one day. You will also take notice in verse 8, there was evening and morning, second day. He repeats that same concept, and you see two different things. Number one, you see that in Judaism, why they started their day in the evening instead of in the morning like we do, 12 midnight. They started around 6 o'clock or sunset in the evening. That's because days started in Genesis chapter 1 with the evening, and it lasted the evening and the day, and then the next day or day 2. The second thing is that when you're talking about creation, we're talking about 6 literal days of creation. At least I do, and a host of others do as well. And we see that what God is doing in the writing of Moses, he's pointing out day 1, the second day, the third day. When he puts those numbers to it, it nails it down that the writer is trying to communicate days of creation. Let's also take notice of his creation. Let's see, look at chapter 1, verse 31. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, 6th day. That's the last day of creation, and he finished the work, chapter 2, and he rested. Sabbath, rest. That's what that means. Now, it doesn't mean that God got tired and he laid down to take a nap. It simply means he rested from his labor. He quit working. He quit continuing a creation of the creation. He stopped. That's basically all that indicates. The Sabbath day was to be remembered because of that. We also take notice of some things that kind of stood out after I saw a particular video. And one of them is that there is a distinction between God's creation, what he said, Genesis 1, and the creation that Moses and the children of Israel came out of. What do you mean? They heard the Egyptian priests tell them how man was created. And it was the gods who would do this and they would do that. And then they went into a land, a Canaan land, where the gods would tell them how the heavens and the earth were created. So here is God in chapter 1 telling mankind how the heavens and the earth were created in 6 days, not over millions and millions and millions of years. Vast difference. And when he tells them that, there are two things that stand out. Number one, God's creation has no fight in it. God doesn't have to fight anybody, any way or shape, in order to create. However, the gods, as it has been reported in other ancient stories, the gods had to fight to make the world. One god even had to kill another god, use her body to build the sky and the earth. God doesn't have to fight. He speaks. Let there be light. God said, God said, God said, and it was so. The second thing that we would draw attention to is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, especially. People are created with honor, in honor, not to be slaves to the gods. God did not create man in order that man could be a slave to him. Well, that's not the case with the creation that the gods that they were brought up with. They read where their gods would create human beings so that the human beings could serve. Other nations would believe that their gods were weak, but the Bible does not teach that particular philosophy within scriptures. I think it would be good just to call your attention to these verses if you want to listen to them fairly quickly. In Acts chapter 17, 22 through 30, Paul is speaking to pagans, those who worship the idols, and there's more than they can count. He calls attention to the unknown God and their religion and their superstition. And then he says, neither is he served with men's hands as though he had need of anything. So the gods would create mankind to serve them. God would not create mankind in order to be his servants. Paul would also refer to it in verse 27. He created them so that they would seek after him. He's not very far from all of us, for in him we live, move, and have our very being, he says. And then he calls attention. We are his offspring. We ought not to think that the Godhead is likened unto gold or silver. It's not stone and rock. That's an important distinction between the gods of Canaan and the gods of Egypt and all the other gods. Well, Moses has made it clear who God is. Now let me cover some other passages that discuss creation. First of all, we would take notice of Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. In verse 8, in giving the 10 commandments to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, he would say, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Then he states, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is Sabbath unto Jehovah. In it thou shalt do no work. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day, hallowed it, or set it aside, consecrated it unto mankind. This passage is very clear. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. I remember a number of decades ago, we were down at Denton, Texas, and they had a particular gentleman in one of our colleges, one of our universities, one of our schools, and he would teach long millions of years of creation instead of day creation, a young earth. And they were asking him about this passage that it says in 6 days. And he responded and said, well, one of these days we will probably find some sort of archaeological study and it will show us what Moses meant by days. Don't you consider that rather foolish? In 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what Moses is writing in Exodus 20. We also take notice and have taken notice of Mark chapter 10, verses 6 through 9. But from the beginning of creation, male and female created he him. There's more to it because he would quote Genesis chapter 2. Turning our attention to Psalm chapter 8, verse 4, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Thou hast made him a little lower than angels, but he's to have dominion. And that's what we found out also in the book of Genesis. Very hurriedly, we have pointed out that God's greatness. Now you have to stop and think instead of just hearing those verses. You have to put them together and you have to recognize when you go outside at night and you can see the stars and the sun and the moon, and when you see the earth and how magnificent they are, you have to drop to your knees in tremendous awe of the great God that we serve. That's what all that is saying. It's not simply words to outdo the gods and the writings of the gods of that day, but instead, God is trying to tell us he is God and there is none other. We are his creation, and magnificent we are. Psalm 139, which I did not get to. Look now at Genesis chapter 2. I will pause a moment while you're turning to Genesis 2. And if you have a question over Genesis 1, I'll be glad to cover it. That's all the time you get. Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 has been a magnificent chapter to me over the last 2 decades when I read what I'm going to read to you in this reading. Genesis chapter 2 is not a different creation stated in a different way. It's the creation stated in greater detail. That's what Genesis 2 is. I would like to go into that, but I'm not going to. We would take notice of chapter 2, verse 15. Jehovah took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to dress and to keep it. There's man's work. Jehovah God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest, thou shalt surely die. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, Adam is still alive, and he lives over 900 years. So how is that fulfilled? I've always explained it this way by Adam Clark, and it makes the point. In dying, thou shalt die. Whenever they partook of the tree, Adam and Eve died that day, that very day. There was a spiritual separation from God. God came in the cool of the evening every afternoon, and Adam, where art thou? Well, I'm hiding. Well, why are you hiding? Because I'm naked. Who told you you were naked? God knew immediately, and even before, that now his creation had committed great transgression and gone against his commandments. And they died that day, but they were still talking to him. In dying spiritually, you will die physically. And they were cast out of the garden. Now turn with me to the magnificent part. That's the sinful part. The magnificent part in chapter 2, verse 7. And Jehovah God formed man out of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Jehovah God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he formed out of the ground, made Jehovah to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, good for food, the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the part that is magnificent to me. When God created the heavens and the earth, and he made the garden, and he planted the trees, and put man in that garden, he put a special tree there, pleasant to the eyes, which is different than for food. Pleasant to the eyes is not necessary to sustain life. Pleasant to the eyes maintains happiness and pleasantry in life and joy. That has got to stand out immediately, because that tells you what kind of God you serve. You and I serve not only the great God that created the heavens and the earth, we serve the God that is looking out for our benefit, our good, our pleasantries. A couple of more passages I will add to that. You may remember in, it would be, let's go to Mark 2:27. They were arguing about the Sabbath day, and Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Do you see the power in that? God wants you to rest. So I need to be sure and let my employer know in this area that there needs to be a day off. And as many days as I've had on this earth, I ought to get 2 days off a week. You get right down to it. Turning to 1 Timothy 6, verse 15 through 17, especially 17, charge them that are rich in this present world that they be not high-minded, but let them have their hope set on God, who giveth us richly, abundantly, all things to enjoy. You may also remember that in Genesis chapter 2, that God would cause a great sleep to come upon the man, and he would take the rib of the woman, of the man, and he would create woman. Why? The Bible says, as a helpmeet. I will suggest at this time, she is not one who is being ruled over by the man, but instead they have dominion over the creation. After sin, Genesis chapter 3, that changes. And we have to recognize that change. But we have seen in Genesis chapter 1 God's greatness. We have taken notice in Genesis chapter 2 God's goodness, and that could be multiplied, both of those could, many times. We turn to chapter 3 and we take notice of God's grace. God had told man, of the trees of the garden thou may freely eat, but of the tree in the midst of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not. In the day that thou eatest, thou shalt surely die. Satan, Genesis chapter 3, would come unto the woman, and he would tempt her and deceive her. And that's an important point and distinction to be made. The woman was deceived. Stupid man had his eyes wide open and knew everything that he was doing, and it was absolutely wrong. But the woman was deceived because of her compassionate heart. And we take notice that their discussion is what has God said? And she said, thou shalt not eat of the tree in the midst of the garden. Hath God really said that? Oh, God knows in the day that thou eatest, verse 5, your eyes will be opened, and ye shall be as God, knowing good and evil. So she offered it unto Adam. He partook, and now sin has entered into the world, has been introduced by the serpent. They would normally, verse 8, meet with God in the cool of the evening. But now they have some fig leaves that they have covered themselves with. And they heard the voice of Jehovah walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Jehovah. They died. They're separated from God. That's spiritual separation. When we commit sin, we are separated from God. Jehovah called unto the man, where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice, and I was afraid. I was naked. I hid myself. Who told thee that thou wast naked? God knew what happened. God knew by them knowing that they had partaken of the tree. And he hears the story, and he knows the story, of course. And so in chapter 3, verse 14, he turns his attention unto the serpent. Because thou hast done this, cursed art thou above all cattle, above all every beast. Upon thy belly thou shalt go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. I will put enmity, hostility between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. The fact is that that passage is messianic. You can see from the Jews of Ancient of Days, before the crucifixion of Christ, before the birth of Christ, before the apostles taught, they taught that as being a passage on the Messiah, the days of the Messiah. That's an important point, because today they will not teach that. And we know why. We take notice that there is a death blow upon Satan, destruction, whereas there is a hurtful blow to the heel of the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman. So many things need to be said. You might want to compare Hebrews chapter 2, 14. He partook of flesh and blood like unto his children, that through death, that means he died, a sacrificial death to bring about the hurtful blow to Satan, that he might bring to naught him that had the power of death, that is Satan. 1 John 3:8, he that doeth sin is of the devil sinned from the beginning. To this end was the Son of God manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil. That's Genesis chapter 3, folks, as God would speak unto the serpent or Satan. Chapter 3, verse 16, he turns his attention from the serpent to the woman. And he says, I will greatly multiply thy pain in thy conception. In pain thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. There's a number of consequences concerning the woman. I don't know what kind of pain the woman went through before transgression. I don't even know if there were any births before the transgression. But I do know this. After the transgression, every woman who looks at a woman during childbirth and sees the pain that she is going through, we are reminded of Genesis chapter 3 and the transgression that was brought about and the consequences of that transgression. What a reminder to all men, but especially of the woman. I don't know what thy desire shall be to thy husband. I saw two explanations, and either one of them could be true. I just don't know. And he shall rule over thee. In Christianity and in Judaism, the male does indeed rule over the woman. That does not make her inferior. Ruling over does not make a person inferior. It makes it a function. God is head over Christ, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. But he's not superior to Christ. But it's simply a function that is taking place, a working function. We put it this way. This is not blind servitude, nor is it enlightened servitude. It is divine reason functionality in the home and in spiritual matters. That means God placed the answerable responsibilities and obligations on the man. You don't see that yet, but you have for the woman a relief of the obligations and responsibilities that the man has. He's got to make right decisions, spiritual decisions. So does she. Turn with me to 1 Timothy 2, verse 11. Let a woman learn in quietness with all subjection, but I permit not a woman to teach nor to have dominion over a man, but to be in quietness. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. That's reason number one. Adam was not beguiled, was not deceived, but the woman being beguiled hath fallen into transgression. But she shall be saved through her childbearing if they continue in faith and love and sanctification with sobriety. It does not mean that women who don't have children can't be saved. It just means what a great opportunity and position of privilege the woman has, the man does not have. He cannot bear children. Let me say that again. Our congressmen, our professors in our centers of higher learning that teach healing and medicine don't know that. They have been asked, can a man get pregnant? They can't answer the question. The answer is they can't. The woman can, but not all women will. And a lot of women believe it is a great, great privilege. Some don't. And that's fine with God. But here's the thing they must understand. It's not in great works. It's not in becoming a Peter or a Paul that will save them. What will save them is the same character as men must manifest. And he would say, faith, love, sanctification with sobriety. More could be said, but I stopped there because of time, and we take notice of the man. What a rascal he became. Chapter 3, verse 17, and unto Adam God said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, and toil shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also, thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. And in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, and dust thou art, and dust shalt thou return. I was about 10 years of age, maybe 9. I had no money. This was 100 years ago. My mother found me a job. I had to go to this particular person's house in their backyard where they had strawberry plants and pick the weeds out of the strawberry plants in the garden. I did not like that job at all. I wonder what it would be like before Adam. Hey, Ron, go out to the garden and pick the weeds out of the strawberries. Mom, there ain't none. What a deal. But now It's rough. So the man now has responsibilities, and man is the one that would work and the ground be cursed. Verse 20. And the man called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. Where did Cain get his wife? Wasn't that a question we were asked a while back? Cain got his wife from his mother. There was nothing wrong with the brother sister in that day bearing children. You did not have the problems that you have today with cousins marrying cousins. And the fact that it says that she was the mother of all living would tell you that we have one ancestor. We have one ancestor, whether we be as my mother's folks were, Cherokee Indian, or whether we were black, or whether we were Oriental, or Asian, Arab, doesn't matter. One blood, Acts chapter 17. By that, Paul is not saying that you can give any blood to any man. That's not his point. Looking at verse 24, so he drove out the man, he placed in the east of the garden, Eden, the cherubim, and the flame of a sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. The tree of life is still there, and they'd partake of it, and they would live forever. They can no longer do that. They will now die physically, based upon the transgression that they brought about. We're now in chapter 4, and we've got another 30 minutes to go. If you let me take your time, David. Chapter 4, verse 3, in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto Jehovah, and Abel he brought of the firstlings of the flock and of the fat thereof. Jehovah had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. There's a big discussion over why this is so. And I'm going to suggest to you that's because God accepted Abel's sacrifice, which was a blood sacrifice. It's the first blood sacrifice recorded. And blood sacrifices are sin sacrifices. Were there sacrifices before this concerning blood sacrifices? We don't know, but more than likely there was. The fact is, this is recorded because of what Cain has done. The New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 says, by faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice, a sacrifice that before God was accepted. Cain's sacrifice was not accepted, not because of Cain's attitude. Certainly his attitude was a part of it. God didn't accept Cain's sacrifice because it was not by faith, because it was not what God commanded him to offer. His works were unrighteous. They were evil. They were wicked. That's what John would say in 1 John 3:12. I'll read it. Not as Cain was of the evil one, slew his brother, wherefore slew he him. Why did he kill his brother? Because his works were evil and his brothers righteous. His brothers was right doing. His was wrongdoing. That's what the passage just said. That's why he rose up and committed even greater wickedness against his brother. When God commands, we listen, and you cannot do something by faith unless God gives the word of faith to you. The word of faith is not the concept that the way it's used in the world today. I'm going to finish with chapter 4, verse 25. You can look at chapter 5, God's chronology, as he goes through and tells you how old various people were. Adam lived to be 930 years old. Methuselah lived to be 969. He was the oldest. And Methuselah, the name says judgment, and judgment came, and he died the year of judgment, the year of the flood. Here we have in chapter 5 also the various genealogy. Bobby Keys from Miami, Oklahoma, was in Yukon, Oklahoma, was in Lake Homa. I don't know whether Wanda remembers it or not, at Mustang, Oklahoma, and he quoted this chapter, which really surprised me. Chapter 4, verse 25, when we close. And Adam knew his wife again. She bare a son, called his name Seth. For, said she, God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel. Do you see the power of that passage? Eve knew there was something special about Abel after their fall and the promise of the seed promise to her and her children. And now she says, even though Cain is still alive, she now says that Seth is the appointed seed. And so the Messiah would come through Seth.